Hello, this is Jove Aguas once again, and welcome to my lectures in ethics. We are now in our fourth lecture. So, for this lecture, I will be talking about uh, types of ethics, right? So, meta ethicists, meaning those who study ethics as a discipline, they distinguish two kinds of or two types of ethics: the normative ethics and the non-normative ethics. So we will focus on these two general types of ethics. So first, the normative type of ethics. It determines, this kind of ethics determines what moral standards to follow so that our actions may be morally right or good. The term normative from the word norms, and we have already mentioned norms in our previous lectures, in previous discussions. And by norms, we mean standards, okay, or basis. So when you say norms, these are the prescribed standards. It describes what we need to do so that our actions are right or good. And it also tells us what are the things that we have to avoid because they are wrong or evil. So sometimes we call normative ethics as prescriptive ethics because this kind of ethics prescribes certain norms or standards or rules that we must follow so that our actions or behavior or conduct are right or good. Now, there are two kinds of normative ethics: the general normative ethics and the applied normative ethics, or we just refer to them as general ethics or applied ethics. Okay, so let's talk of the general normative ethics first. By the way, the second type of ethics is the non-normative. Okay, so non-normative because it does not prescribes but rather describes or evaluates our moral attitudes or statements. So it's not a prescriptive ethics but a descriptive ethics because it describes how we make moral assessments, how we make moral judgments, or how we make moral assertions, or what are our moral assertions. Okay, and there are two types of non-normative or descriptive ethics. The first one is scientific or descriptive, and the second is meta ethics. I already mentioned meta ethics in just a while ago. When you say meta ethics, that means these are the people, or this is a discipline rather, that studies ethics itself as a discipline. Okay, we're going to discuss that later on. All right. So let's now discuss the normative ethics. I mentioned there are two: general normative ethics and the applied normative ethics. So when you say general ethics or general normative ethics, it is a reasoned search for the principles of human conduct, meaning it studies the different major theories about what are the things that are good, or what are the acts that are right, and what are the acts that are evil. So a general ethics would prescribe certain norms, and it studies what are these norms. And of course, the norms or the standards of morality will depend on a particular theory, right? It's particular theory. So, for example, Christian ethics is a particular type of ethics, and Christian ethics prescribes certain norms, namely law and conscience. So Christian ethics is an example of a general ethics. So a general ethics also attempts to determine what moral standards we should follow so that our actions are morally right or good. Again, let's use the example of Christian ethics. It tells us that our actions should conform to the law, and it must also conform to a good conscience, to our conscience, which must be good conscience. So it tries to defend a system of basic ethical principles that presumably are valid for everyone. All right. So it tells us that everybody, if you want to be moral, you have to follow these principles. Okay. So whether it be Christian ethics or Buddhist ethics or Confucian ethics, it tells us that these are the things that we have to follow, or these are the rules that we must follow so that we act morally, okay, or rightly. So there are two broad categories of general normative ethics. And these are the teleological or consequential ethics and the ontological or non-consequential ethics. We will discuss and differentiate these two later on or in our succeeding lectures and discussions, right? So the second type of normative ethics is the applied ethics. Okay, so when you say general ethics, it's applied generally to everybody, to everyone, all right, to every human action. Okay, but when you say applied normative ethics, it now talks about how are we going to apply these general norms to specific situation or specific acts or specific moral problems. Okay, so it tries to explain and justify our position on a particular moral issue. All right. So, like for example, how do we apply ethics to capital punishment? Or how do we apply ethics to our respect for life or respect for the life of the unborn, like abortion? Or how do we apply ethics to discrimination? Okay, so it is an apply because now we are trying to apply the general norm to specific or particular situation, right? So it uses the general ethical principles in the general ethics in an attempt to solve a specific moral problem or apply the ethical principle to particular situation, right? So here we can see now ethics branching out to the different disciplines. Like for example, we apply ethics to the health sciences, like bioethics. We apply ethics to environment, environmental ethics. We apply ethics to the different professions, okay, like the profession, the health profession. So we are now talking of professional ethics, or we apply ethics now to the practice of law, legal ethics, or we are now applying ethics to business ethics. So now we go to the different disciplines and apply the ethical principles to these different disciplines. Okay, so there is again forensic ethics. There is aside from all these ethics types of ethics that I have already mentioned, there are many different applications now of ethics. Now, in your medical course, then you're going to take bioethics. If you are taking business course, then you take up business ethics. If you are taking up law, then you have legal ethics, and so on and so forth. So that's applied ethics. Now let's talk about the non-normative ethics. And this is rather complicated. Now because now we are not talking of the prescribed norms generally and specifically to certain issues. We're now talking about how how we study ethics. So it does not tell us how we should apply ethics. It tells us how we do ethics. Okay, how ethics is done. So it describes what ethics is. That's why it's called non-normative, because it does not give us the norms, but it describes the ethics. So the first one is descriptive, or call that scientific ethics. So when you say scientific, it is or descriptive, it is a study of morality which involves the factual investigation of moral behavior. So it's a study of moral behavior. Remember, it's not about telling people what they should do. All right? It study how people do it, or why do people do this, or why do people say this. Okay? So it is concerned about how people do in fact behave. So it does not tell us that if people should be good, they should do this. No, that's not the concern of descriptive ethics. It simply describes. Okay? So, for example, uh, in normative ethics will tell us if you want to be good, you have to be just. Okay? So, it prescribes justice. In non-normative, in descriptive, they're going to say, well, people do this because they have this sense of justice, and our sense of justice may be different from one another, right? Okay, so that's descriptive ethics. Anthropologists and sociologists investigate and describe moral attitudes. So this is the area of the anthropologists or the sociologists, because they are the ones who investigate and describe moral attitudes, the moral codes, you know, the behavior of people, etc., etc. So they are concerned about how moral attitudes and codes differ from one culture to another, or from one society to another society. So they investigate and evaluate, describe the behaviors, the values of different cultures and different societies. But anthropologists will not tell you that, oh, their practice is wrong because it does not follow these norms. It should follow these norms. Now, when you do that, you're no longer an anthropologist. You are now making a moral assertion, and therefore you are now into the area of normative ethics. Now, there are two categories of scientific uh, ethics: absolutism and relativism. Now, just a word about these two. When you say absolutism, an anthropologist is absolutist when he says that there is a universal moral code. Okay, there is a universal moral code common to all these societies, all these cultures. When you are a relativist, you say, well, different cultures, different codes, different societies, different moral values. So that's the relative part. Okay, so absolutism and relativism. We're going to talk about relativism in our succeeding lectures. Okay, in the theories. Now, the second type of non-normative ethics, which is rather complicated because it's a very wide area, is meta ethics. Now, let me explain first what we mean by meta here. The word meta, because that's very crucial to our discussion. The word meta could literally mean, what could be translated literally as beyond or after. Okay, after. Beyond. So the beyond could be above, right? It could be above, beyond, or it could be far. Okay. Now, if we are going to use the word meta as something that's beyond, something that is on top. Okay. So imagine if you are on top and you apply ethics. So when you say meta ethics, it is something that is beyond or above ethics. And when you say above ethics, if you're above, then you have a view of what is below. And what is below you? Ethics. So when you say meta ethics, it means that you take a higher perspective so that you can see what is below. Okay? So you can examine what is below. And what is being examined in meta ethics? Ethics itself. They study the discipline of ethics itself. So when you say meta ethicists, these are investigators, these are thinkers, philosophers, ethicists also, who take a higher perspective and try to evaluate what ethics is doing, or what ethics is all about. So the meta ethics is not after whether an action is right or wrong. That's not the concern of the meta ethicist. The meta ethicist's concern is to study how is this discipline of ethics being studied, or how does it study certain things? All right. So you can apply this notion of meta to some other things, like say when you say meta pragmatics. When you say meta pragmatics, you study how people practice certain things. Okay, so you take a vantage perspective, a higher perspective, and try to study what is below. So it is a highly technical discipline now because it tries to investigate the meaning of, for example, ethical terms, including the critical study of how ethical statements can be verified. When you say ethical statements, these are moral assertions. Like, for example, I say stealing is bad. So, how do we analyze the statement stealing is bad or corruption is evil? How do we analyze that? Okay, and now that is the concern of the meta ethicist, to study how are these methical or ethical or moral statements should be evaluated or should be analyzed. Okay, so it is concerned with the meaning of terms like right. So what do you mean by right, or obligation, or responsibility, or justice, or wrong, or good? So what do you mean by that? That is the concern of the meta ethicist. Okay, so the meta ethicist, because it's a non-normative ethics, does not propose any moral principle or norms of action. It is solely consists of philosophical analysis, analyzing the terms, analyzing the statements, analyzing the behavior, analyzing the codes, etc., etc. Okay, so again, um, take note that when you say meta, you are taking a higher perspective and try to look down below and try to analyze, these concepts and codes, etc., etc. All right. Now, there are three meta-ethical positions. The first one is naturalism. It maintains that ethical statements, meaning statements with moral basis assessment, like for example, we say corruption is evil. Okay, it maintains that that statement can be translated into non-ethical statements. What do I mean by non-ethical statement? These are statements without moral valuation or assessment. It can be interpreted that way. So, for example, I say corruption is evil. Okay? So, when I say corruption is evil, of course, it can be interpreted as a moral statement. What do you mean by moral statement? It tells us that corruption is evil. Okay? But you can also interpret it as non-ethical. All right? How? So when I say corruption is evil, it could mean that the person does not like corruption. Okay? Or that he disapproves corruption. So he's not. There is a difference between the two because, uh, well, I can say lying is bad. It can also mean that, well, lying is bad means that we should not lie. Okay, so there's a difference between the moral statement and the non-moral statement, and naturalism tells us that we can interpret moral statements as non-moral statements. Okay, so there are three kinds now of naturalism here. So it becomes more complicated because of all this distinction. The first one is autobiographical naturalism. It simply says that an ethical or moral statement can expresses the approval or disapproval of the one saying the statement, of the speaker. So when I say healing is bad, it means that I don't like healing. Okay? For some other reasons, I don't like healing. Okay? I'm not saying that healing is wrong as something that we shouldn't do, but I just don't like it. Okay, so he's not tell the person may not be saying, may not be judging killing as bad. He is just saying that he does not like it. Okay? Like when you say the food is bad. What does it mean the food is bad? Well, it could mean that he does not like the food. It's not that the food is not really bad or is really bad. It's just that he does not like eating the food. You see, that's the point of naturalism, autobiographical naturalism. The second is sociological naturalism. An ethical statement simply expresses the approval or disapproval of the majority. So when you say autobiographical, it talks about the person, individual. In sociological, it talks about the majority. Okay. So again, when you say killing is bad, the majority, the society, for example, majority of people say, well, I don't like killing. So when, for example, Filipinos say, well, AJK is bad, they may not be making a moral assessment about the evil of killing. It's just that we don't like AJK. Okay. Again, using the food example, when, for example, the class says the menu is bad, does it really mean that the menu, the food, the serve is not really good tasting, or simply that we don't like it? We like something else. See, that's the point of sociological. I hope you understand. Okay, and then the last one is theological naturalism. That an ethical statement simply expresses either the approval or disapproval of a divine being or God, for example. So when you say killing is bad, it simply means that God does not like killing. Okay? So the difference of the three is that who makes the statement? It could be the person, it could be the group, or it could be a divine being. Okay? But naturalism simply tells us that uh, moral statements can be interpreted as a non-moral state. Okay? So when you say mm, honesty is good, well, a person can say, well, I just like people who are honest. It's not that he is saying that honesty is really a good act to do, but he would like it if people are honest. Okay. Now, the second type of meta ethics is non-naturalism. Okay. So, an ethical statement cannot be translated into a non-ethical form. So, when you say non-naturalism, it is the opposite of naturalism. Naturalism says ethical statement can be translated into ethical form, into a non-ethical statement. Now, naturalism say no, that cannot happen. It cannot be translated into a non-ethical form because some ethical terms can only be defined in terms of other ethical words. So, for example, how do you interpret, how do you translate the word right? Well, when you say right, you explain right by using another ethical terms like, well, right means good or right means just. Okay? So if the naturalist would say uh, good means liking, when I say something is good, that means I like it. According to the non-naturalist, that is not possible because when you say good, what do you mean by good? No, good is not liking something. Good means right. So you will need another ethical term to explain an ethical term. So when you say a statement like King was right, what do you mean by King is right? You don't interpret it as King is right that you like the king. No, no. When you say the king is right, that means what he did, okay, is good. The king was right means what the king did is good. Okay, so you translate the statement, the ethical statement, by using another ethical term or translate it into another ethical statement. I hope that's clear. The difference between the naturalist and the non-naturalist. Okay. Now this is very important because not only in ethics, okay, not only in ethics, but even in our conversation. Because, for example, when you say your shirt is good, what do you mean by your shirt is good? You mean that my shirt fits me, or it could mean that you like my shirt. So you see, it's how we try to interpret these things because uh, even again in our society, many government officials are making pronouncement here and there. But how do we interpret their pronouncement, their statements? Are we going to interpret them naturally or non-naturally? All right. So you see President Duterte making pronouncements on television, or the IATF, okay, making pronouncements about the quarantine, about the pandemic. So how do we interpret? How do we translate their statements? It's very important to understand how to interpret statements. And of course, as I've said, that's taking a meta, no, a meta perspective. No? All right. So in this sense, they cannot be verified as true or false, but can only be believed. That's the non-naturalist. Now, the third one is emotivism or non-cognitivism. Okay? It claims that ethical statements are used to evoke a predetermined emotive response, meaning there is some emotional element, okay, in our statement. Emotional, no? There's emotional character in our statement. That when we say something, it evokes an emotional response. Okay, it evokes an emotional response from the people who were listen or hear or read our statement, so that in some way or another they are compelled to behave in a certain way. Give you one example. When somebody says cheating is bad, it's not just about to say that cheating is wrong. It evokes an emotional response that we should not cheat. So when we hear people say killing is evil, it's not just about that killing people is evil against the law. It also tells us that we should not kill. See? Or when you say corruption is evil, it's not just about that corruption is bad or an unjust act. We should not be corrupt. Right? Or when I say studying is good, it's not just about the fact that studying is right. It also evokes an emotional response that we should study. See? So that's the point of emotivism, right? So uh, these different types of ethics tells us a lot about ethics. That ethics can be studied from different perspectives. Okay, so let me repeat: there are two types of ethics. The normative or prescriptive ethics divided into two. You have the general ethics and the applied ethics, and then you have the non-normative divided into the scientific ethics and meta ethics. Okay, so I hope uh, that discussion is clear and help you understand the discussion. Now, just to enrich you know, our discussion here, I will leave you with some discussions, questions for your discussion. So, just to, what do you think? Because you are of course, in your career, in your course, uh, medicine. What do you think is the most crucial issue in bioethics? This is applied ethics, right? All right. What do you think? Just in general, what do you think is the most crucial issue in bioethics and why? You're not you're not going to resolve the issue, but just what do you think is the most crucial issue in bioethics in your would-be career? And number two, from a meta-ethical perspective, how should we interpret the saying honesty is the best policy? So you can use any of the meta-ethical perspectives that we have discussed and try to interpret honesty is the best policy. Okay. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you have learned some, a thing or two from this discussion. Thank you very much.